Hello everybody, I'm pleased to say that I'm in front of the camera and this is a brand new video that is coming to you a bit sooner than my previous videos, because my previous videos, they were a bit, 4 months, not, beg your pardon, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, something like that, and I didn't always get to put out videos every 2 weeks, because the goal is to try and do it every 2 weeks. Having said all of this, I want to get straight into it. So anyway, I've got some new books that I want to show you. I've got a pile of books. Some of them are just from my library. Others are bought new, or at least bought them recently. So I'm going to start with this one. This is one that I've just finished. This is by Kurt Ries, Berlin, 1945 bis 1953. So from Berlin from 1945 to 1953. This book is written in German, and that's why I'm so proud of having read it all the way through, because my German is nowhere near, or my reading German is nowhere near as reading English. Therefore it's harder to get through it, and because of that I have to have, this is the translation, this is the English book. Let me see if I got, because this is I've got it here, there we go, Berlin Story. So this is the English, and it was translated into German. Kurt Ries is a journalist and an author, and he managed to get into Berlin, I believe, in 1945, and then he returned some years later, perhaps in 48. Don't quote me on it. I'd have to go through the whole book again just to find out, to see how accurate that is. But these are very, it's well written. I could understand it, and as I was reading through the book, and as I got towards the end of the book, I started to get into the flow. So that is to say, I could start to understand the German that I was reading a lot more than when I started. I started reading this book during the COVID, and I stopped at page 60. So what I'm doing now is to go through reading it from the beginning up to page 60, so that I've effectively covered the whole book from when I started to read it, because I continued it from page 60 as opposed to starting it from the beginning. This book really gets into the nitty-gritty and the details of what the Berliners went through after the war stopped. So when the war stopped, they said that it's almost like they could hear themselves think, whereas before they were always in a state of anxiety and panic and fear and worry. Will they be able to see tomorrow? Because of the constant shelling, because of the constant bombing from the Allies, from the RAF and the United States, because the RAF were bombing during the night and the United States were bombing during the day. So the air raid shelters would be constantly going off. They'd have to constantly rush into their air raid shelters. There was no respite from it. And then when the Russians got to Berlin, you had the artillery shells. So the artillery shells were going, and you could tell the difference between the artillery shells and the bombing from aircraft. So the Lancasters that were dropping their bombs would have this whistling sound, and the shells would have the artillery shells would have a slightly different sound compared to the bombs being dropped from the bombers, because they had that whistle coming down. And then when the Russians got to Berlin, they were all clearly frightened and concerned as to what would happen to them, and their worries would effectively come to life, because a lot of rapes were being carried out on a lot of the women, and the famous term that they heard from the Russians is Frau komm. That means Frau come, or woman come. But you know that today that has a different kind of connotation, as you could understand. But in at the end of the war, it was quite different. It just means woman, come with me. But the underlining meaning of that was rape. They would actually get raped, and not just the one soldier. It would be several soldiers, you know, and then there would be other soldiers coming in, you know, like for their go, you know. I mean, it's gruesome, and you could hear the screams from the women, you know, as they were being raped or being gang raped as effectively because it was overwhelming. And not only that, it was young girls as 12. No, you get it. You'd read it clearly in this book here. You get it clearly in this book here, and that surprised me because this book was published in like 1953. It's not the kind of thing that I'd expect to read in a book like this. So I mean, it really does cut to the bone. But this is the other book that I got. Is a woman in Berlin. I believe I showed this on one of my other videos, where a woman kept a diary, and she didn't want anybody to know who she was when this book was released. She kept a diary for about 3 months, so it's quite a lot in terms of, you see that's all in 3 months. So she would be quite descriptive in what she'd experienced and what she saw, and it kind of, this book speaks up for this book, whereas this book will only talk about maybe in three pages. This is a whole book about it. So it's something that I don't think the women that went through it ever got over. It was just too traumatizing and too overwhelming for them, and consequently it affected them for the rest of their life. The Berlin, this Berlin book goes also into how the Russians were still fighting. So the fighting would go on, and they could hear them on the rooftops. You'd hear soldiers running on the rooftops. They actually said that's what they would hear, and that they would, and sometimes the fighting would be rushing from room to room, and a lot of the women were having to sort of escape from the fighting, and a lot of them were actually putting out their white sheets out of their windows just to signal to the Russians that they've surrendered and that there are no German soldiers in the building. But when the war actually ended, they said that there was this deafening silence. It was just this silence that they said that from 5 years of war, about 5 years of war, where certainly for the Berliners, where there was no bombing at all. It said it really was. It was a moment to behold, because they knew at that point that the war was over. The other thing that the Berliners obviously said, one was the cold, one was the hunger, one was the loss of a place to live because of the destruction of the city. So they were living in cellars, they were living in buildings that were partially destroyed but still habitable. I remember seeing a documentary where literally the wall is missing, and you could actually see into the person's living room, and there's a table there, and there's this elderly lady sort of just attending to the table, and it's all open. You could actually see everything inside the building. I mean, it's just unreal. But you see, they just used up everything that they could, because there was no place to live other than in the buildings and in the cellars that were available. And then, of course, you had the refugees coming in from Eastern Germany, from East Prussia. So they were looking for places to live. So it was a really chaotic and difficult time, and a lot of people were suffering because of the cold winters that they had to endure. The other thing is that they said about the Russians was that they would actually go into people's homes, force them out from their homes, and then when they were invited to go back into their homes, there was nothing there. It was stripped out. Everything was taken out of the building. Carpets, furniture, pictures, any valuables, watches. They always talked about the watches. You'd actually see Russians with 3 or 4 watches on each wrist. And some of the soldiers couldn't tell the time. They just liked the watches. And there were others that set the time. They didn't set it to Berlin time. They set it to Moscow time. So they had a different time, when they were looking at their watch, because they were looking at Moscow time rather than Berlin time. So it was things like that. And then they would go back into their homes. And, I mean, it was just a wreck. And they would say that they didn't know, what a toilet was. So they'd like put food down there, and like if they wanted milk or something, to keep it cool, or butter or something, and then they would flush, and then they couldn't understand why it disappeared. All of a sudden, the food that they put down in the toilet disappeared. They couldn't understand why. So and water coming from they say, instead of saying tap, they said water from the wall. That's what they would call it, water from the wall. These soldiers, they were didn't have a chance to bathe. They hadn't washed in weeks, if not months. All their uniforms were in bad shape. I mean, this is war at its most brutal. So it was a culture shock for the Berliners, who were quite different to the Russians that actually came into the city. And it was a while before, it was only, I think, July before the Allies actually, which is the Americans, the British and the French, actually got into the city. So that gave them respite. And then, of course, the city itself was divided into different zones. So that's, I want to do more on this story, but it's almost like Kurt Reese does a really good job, but there's so many different subjects. There's so many. He tells so many different stories, and there's only so much that he can actually explain in a book of this size. So, well worth reading. I mean, the book has long since been deleted, but for my own investigation and my fascination and interest in Berlin, it was an eye-opener. Let's see what I have. There's a book here I got. I mean, this is slightly different because it's kind of what the Germans did to the rest of Europe in terms of looting, and all empires do it. All empires do it. Looting is an Indian word. It actually comes from the Indians when India was a colony to and part of the British Empire, and it's just this picture gives an insight of something that's been completely stripped bare, and this is what the Russians did when they actually got into Berlin. Now, on the back here, you've got these sort of ornaments, these statues, and what they tried to do, the Germans tried to do, was they tried to concrete them over so that it wouldn't be damaged during the course of the war. Now, I've seen it in old documentaries where these statues are, but where they are now, my guess is that they're in museums. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know which museums they are, but there's certainly ones that I'd be interested in, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to recreate history from what you could see, from what there is available, the information available. And from my point of view, is to be able to try and recreate in my mind part of Berlin history. And part of Berlin history is actually seeing what was once there, and that if you went to Berlin now, is no longer there. Let me see. I thought I'd mention this. I believe in the late 70s, early 80s, there used to be a TV series called Secret Army. Secret Army, what that was, it was an underground group of people in Belgium that would help airmen that were shot down, for them to get to through to France and then on to Spain, and then from Spain back to the UK. And I have to say this because as I was going through my books, I picked this one up. And I know this isn't about Berlin, but what it is about, it's the sense of being under occupation that I really, really liked. And what it felt like if you were in a situation, say in Berlin or in Stuttgart or in München or in any other of the European countries that were under occupation. And I think with this one is the makers of this series did such a good job that you get the feel. And I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say by feel, but you get the sense of fear, you get the sense of trepidation, you get the sense of what it is like to be under occupation, and you get the sense of you could be arrested at any moment. The Gestapo could come in at any moment and they could arrest you. And there are people in Berlin who, Jews for example, they had to live with this every day. But I don't have anything related to Berlin like I have Secret Army, because Secret Army really does capture something very special and unique. The acting, the story, even the music, everything comes together very, very well in such a way that you get so engrossed in it that you feel like you're one of the participants in what's being shown in the series. Now, I haven't seen it in a long time, but I know my friend John has. And one of the reasons when I found this book, I was thinking of my mate John, because he said how good Secret Army is. And I remember watching it in the 80s. I mean, I was enthralled. So if you really want to get into World War II, not just from documentaries, but I mean, they were great films. Of course there are great films, but this is a series, so this goes on from week to week. I highly recommend that you watch Secret Army. Okay, there's a YouTuber who calls himself Interesting Books Reviewed. And I watched his YouTube presentation on banned books. Now, I don't have any banned books, but I have controversial books. And this is one of them. David Irving Goebbels. Now, this came out in the 90s. At that time, Russia was open. By that I mean you could go to Russia and look inside their archives. So it was Yeltsin. Yeltsin was in power at the time. So at the time, David Irving could go into their archive, and he actually was able to see the Goebbels diaries. Goebbels was a ferocious diarist. I mean, he wrote pages and in the thousands, absolutely in the thousands. Now, I have a few books on a diary. Here's one that I've got which written by a Jewish lady. This is one I just picked up. I found this in a charity shop, and because it says diary, I had to get it, because diaries are written at the time. They're not written retrospectively. They're not written, say, 3 years, 5 years after the event. They were written at the time, and that's what's so crucial, because you want to be able to actually get inside the person's mind to actually get a feel of what it was that he or she was going through at the time. So this one why I mention this is one, because it's David Irving, because of the controversy, you know, him being accused of being a Holocaust denier. And the other thing is the fact that he got to see those diaries before anyone else did. Those diaries, because the way that Goebbels wrote was so almost incomprehensible, it was very, very difficult to read his writing. And he also wrote in that old German script. So it was very difficult, but he was actually able to decipher them. Now, that's that one. Now I've got another book here, Goebbels by Peter Longerich. I think it's Peter Longerich, I think his name is. And he talks about the various biographies on Goebbels. And he gives his own views about how good or how not good they are. And I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of biographies on Goebbels out there, but he never mentions David Irving's book. And that, you know, because of his name, you know, he doesn't want to soil himself with having the reputation or the accusation of being accused of reading David Irving's book. But what he does cover is the ones that he did read. Now, I don't doubt he read that book. I mean, personally, I got no doubts about it at all. It's just that he just doesn't mention it in his book. This author read through the entire diary, and I believe that the diaries are available. With diaries, especially somebody like him, he was clearly in the thick of it. He actually saw what was going on, and him, you know, his hatred for the Jews and the fact that he was a Gauleiter, meaning that he was in charge of Berlin itself. Hitler actually gave him that responsibility. So you really do get a deep dive and going down the rabbit hole of what it was like in the Nazi party, how it functioned, how he was always at odds with other party officials, and he had the reputation of being this genius of propaganda, where this author questions that genius, whether it really was, or maybe he was a genius to give himself the impression that he is this genius of propaganda, if you get my meaning. But if there's anything that I've learned, is that you cannot just take the word of any particular author, however well-intentioned it might be. You have to read from many different points of view and from many different authors to get a deep understanding of who Goebbels or any historical figure ever was. So that's Goebbels, Lord Haw-Haw. I've got 2 books on Lord Haw-Haw. This is my 3rd book on Lord Haw-Haw. I got this because it was really cheap. I can see why it was cheap. But all the pages are intact. There's no annotations in the book. There's no bent corners of pages, which I absolutely hate. But what makes this book so unique is the fact that it was published in 1946. I think it was in 1964. So it's published in 1964. So it was nearer the time of when Lord Haw-Haw was hung. If you've watched my other video, you will see my opinion is that they brought in a new law, a treason law, and I believe that that law was passed in order to be able to hang Lord Haw-Haw. So this was all pre-planned. They rushed through this new law. So when Lord Haw-Haw was flown from Germany to the UK, he was a dead man walking. I mean, it was game, set and match as far as Lord Haw-Haw was concerned. But his wife was just as guilty as he was, and she got off scot-free. They let her go. I don't know if this was a sense of guilt or something that they pre-planned, but certainly this is a form of lawfare that you can clearly see if you were to actually take the time and be prepared to do some investigating. That's my view on Lord Haw Haw. Okay, so Dismembered Policing in Post-War Berlin by Mark Fenimore. I take a great stock and great value in documents. I think documents, especially those that have been released to the public by the government or governments, give a deep insight into the thinking of the governments of the day. Now, a lot of these government files, these documents, get filtered, redacted, destroyed, and so on, and even used as misinformation to mislead the public. Then you get scholarly books like this one. This is not a book that you'd expect to find in Waterstones, or if you're from the United States, Barnes and Noble. You're not going to find a book like this. This is the kind of book that you'll find in the university library, because this is written by people like university professors and scholars and people that have letters after their name. A book like this is not going to sell more than, 2,000 copies, and that's being generous. I got this book as a result of reading this one. In this book here, there's like maybe two pages about the police, or the police in Berlin. This is a whole book. So this is what it means to be like somebody who investigates. When you're studying a subject, you have to go through many sources and from experts, especially if you can find experts and witnesses of the time. So you get the oral history as well. Now, a lot of the people that were alive at the time clearly have passed on. But when you get to something like this is like a scholar who's really taken the time and who's got the funding to be able to write a book like this. Now, I haven't read this book. I haven't had the chance to read this book, simply because I've only just bought it. It's brand new, and it was only released last year. But I understand that there were two different police forces within the city. You had the Soviet police, so that was under the Soviets, and then you had the Allied policing, and then you had the MPs of military police, and there were it was very disruptive. Now, I've heard through other police forces from podcasts on YouTube where the police forces of different, from counties like the Metropolitan Police, I think the London Police, they don't like to always cooperate with each other. This was far worse. This was on another level. They never used to there wasn't any kind of cooperation. There was always this animosity between the forces that were in that were dealing with the city as it once was at that time, meaning the destruction of the city, the loss of life, the refugees that were coming in from the east, the homelessness, because a lot of people were bombed out of their homes, the criminality, the looting. It goes on, the black market, of course. It goes on and on and on. So literally from scratch, they had to build up a police force that was able to police the entire city. And if you have a city that's divided in 4 zones, you're going to get conflict. And clearly these people, the police of a particular part of Berlin, or say the Western police force, were always being undermined by the Soviet police force. Also, there were kidnappings. What they would do is that you'd get either the police of the Soviet sector that would go into West Berlin, and if there was someone that they wanted to pick up, they would just bundle him in the back of a van or in a car, and then they would take him to the east, to the eastern sector, and then they would put him on trial. And then they were saying that some of these people would just disappear. You'd never see them again. That was the end of, if they were sent to Siberia, who knows? They would just disappear. And this happened not only in the 40s, but in the 50s. And there were tactics that they would use in order, like, say, for example, if they had already kidnapped someone, and the West Berlin police would chase after the East German police or Secret Service men, they would sprinkle like these kind of sharp objects onto the road. So if you were to drive over it, it would puncture your wheels, or it would puncture your tyres. All kinds of shenanigans like that. This was it was almost becoming an art. But as far as the police were concerned, it was a very, very difficult situation, and something that really couldn't be solved. It was just a quagmire. It was a mess. But as time went on, and during the course of the 50s, and I think as the Berlin Wall was built, I think now you had the division, and having that division, you had the differentiation between the two systems. So even as bad as it was by building the Berlin Wall, it started to settle. Situation started to settle between the two sides because of the ideology of the communist system in the East and the capitalistic system in the West. Okay, spying. This is a book on Christine Granville, who was the first female secret agent of World War II. This is a tragic story, actually. But this isn't a review of this lady, of her spying, of her story. It's about spies in Berlin. There are hundreds of them. The reason why I show this book is because I haven't got anything on the CIA in Berlin, and this sort of puts a human face on the spying game. There's like John le Carre's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. There's the Berlin Game Set and Match, but these are all fictional stories. I don't have anything on the spying of in Berlin. One must remember that Berlin was in the centre of East Germany. You had to go through East German territory before you got to Berlin. This was the Cold War, and so you had to travel through these 3 designated corridors, whether you flew into Berlin, or whether you took the train, or whether you drove into Berlin. It was strictly controlled at both ends. So once you crossed the border from West Germany into East Germany, it was strictly controlled. And then once you got in, just before getting into Berlin, again it was strictly controlled. Now we have all this technology and everything is digital and AI. And in those days, everything was analog, but it was like up to the minute technology of what they were using. the spying game was massive, and there were like agents and double agents and triple agents, and you know, and for some people it was the thrill, for others it was the danger, for others it was the ideology, and for someone else it's the money. I do not have anything on the spying game in Berlin, sadly. That's the kind of like gaping hole that I've got in my book collection, that I don't have anything on spying in Berlin. So what I have to do is I have to try and find from other sources how spying worked. This is a book by John Marks called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA Mind Control. Books like these to try and get an insight, an understanding, an idea of what spying was like in Berlin. There are documentaries, I've watched a few of them, but there weren't any that gave me a deep understanding and insight as to what actually went on during the Cold War. I really wish I knew. But that doesn't mean to say I'm giving up on it. And that's why I'm willing to read books such as this to try and figure out what the CIA were doing when they were in Berlin. Now I'm going to talk about something controversial and dark, and it might disturb some people. I can't say I am comfortable talking about it, because I'm not. But it goes back to the to this book. In my last video, I mentioned about paedophilia, or child molestation, or chomos as they call them in the United States. This is a book by Sabine Darnen. If anybody during the 90s remembers Marc Dutroux, the monster of Belgium, where it nearly brought the country down to a standstill because of the protest against the government. This is something that is so dark and deep, and you know, you don't get to shine a light on it because it's so evil. And in this book I had a clue, because I was reading between the lines, where it actually said that there were children going missing, and to this day children are going missing. And I actually said in this book that flesh was being sold off as sausage meat, and I don't doubt it. I would also say that there were pets being killed, for which is quite understandable. I mean, I get that. But children, that's on another level. But this is written by a survivor. She was actually a survivor when she was in one of the dungeons that Marc Dutroux kept her in, and that's a picture of her as a child, what she looked like. And it's all over YouTube. If you really want to get into this stuff, it's all over YouTube. This is the only book I've got, but it's through reading this book and watching documentaries on it that I understood this one. So I mention it because it's so much part of the Berlin story, and yet it's so much part of today. There are people in power that are doing all sorts of dark stuff, and you know, if it disturbs you, then yeah, I understand. But it's something I think we need to look into if we are to eradicate it from society. But it's powerful people that are doing this sort of stuff, and yeah, I mean I find it uncomfortable even just talking about it right now on camera. Okay, I want to do one on the Berlinologists gang. I've got the Berlinologists Complex by Stefan Aust, and I've got Rudi Dutschke by Gretchen Dutschke. So it's written by a relative or a brother. Berlinologists. It was a terrorist organisation that started, or was triggered by a killing of a protester or a bystander, let's put it that way, by the police. That one incident set off a whole train of protests by the students in Berlin, and I mean it was like a fever. It just caught on in other cities around Europe, like London and Paris. I don't know enough about it. I'm focusing more on the Berlinologists gang, on more of Berlin, and as to what was it that was radicalizing the students of the day. And one of the reasons was the Vietnam War. The other one was the capitalistic system and Marxism, and it's a whole range of things that are not quite clear to me at this very moment in time. This lasted for 3 generations. There were 3 generations of the Berlinologists gang. The Berlinologists gang, the first generation are the most famous. Baader, so Andreas Baader, Gudrun Enslin, and Ulrike Meinhof. Now, Andreas Baader and Gudrun Enslin were a couple, and it should have been called Baader Enslin as opposed to Baader Meinhof. Ulrike Meinhof was a little bit older. She was an intellect. She was a journalist, and she'd appeared on television giving interviews and things like that. So it was for her to go and become this, terrorist, with machine guns, blowing up US army bases and robbing banks. I mean, it's unheard of, and clearly she wasn't made for this. She was an intellect. But they were eventually caught. I think they started on this spree of robbing banks and blowing up army base, leaving bombs in army bases and department stores. And they were eventually caught in 1972. And then they were put into prison in Standheim, and it was a complex that was built specifically for them. And so you get this the radicalization of these group of terrorists and what they did, and then you get the court judgment, because they were taken from their cells to the court, which was within the prison, and they had these judges, and that was like the second part of the story, where they were defending their radical ideas. And then, of course, you had the second generation. And the second generation hijacked a Lufthansa plane, and they flew it to Mogadishu. And in order to free the hostages, they set up an organisation called the SG9, or the SG9, which is like a wing of the police, but kind of modelled on the SAS. And it was through their training that they were successful in the operation, in freeing the hostages of that Lufthansa plane in Mogadishu, killing the terrorists. However, Martin Schleyer, who was kidnapped, he was one of these. I think I can't consciously remember what his title was, but one of the things that they were clear about was the fact that he was in the SS during World War II. And there were a few close moments where the police were onto them, but they didn't quite catch them. And Gudrun, Andreas Baader, Gudrun Ensslin, and Ulrike Meinhof by this time had committed suicide, I think in 1976. When the news came over to Andreas Baader and Gudrun Ensslin while they were in prison, they decided to commit suicide, and they had a gun. Andreas Baader had a gun in his cell. You can't make it up. It's an actual fact. He had a gun, and Gudrun Ensslin strung herself up by the neck. They had radio communication between the cells. This is how well organised they were. I mean, it's on another level. It's on another scale, and they were able to undermine the prison service, the police service, and the judicial service. This is how powerful and how dangerous the Baader-Meinhof gang were, and not only to that, but also to the public. So the state had to do everything it could to snuff them out. Now, as for Martin Schleyer, when they found out that the operation had failed in Mogadishu, there was a phone call made to the kidnappers of Martin Schleyer. And they told him, and the answer that they got was, okay, click. That's all they had to say. And Martin Schleyer by then was a dead man walking, because he was put into a boot of a car, was driven out into the woods. They took him out the boot, and I think both of them put a bullet in his head. That pretty much signalled the end of the affair, but it didn't signal the end of the Red Army faction, as they called themselves, or the Baader-Meinhof gang. Because to call themselves the Baader-Meinhof gang, you got to think by 1977 they were pretty much all dead. There's only a few from the first generation that lived, and still alive today. This is a really a thick book. It's going to take a while to read it. And Stefan Aust knew Ulrike Meinhof. He knew her, and but he always felt. I mean, in one of his interviews, he said that he didn't. What he thought of her was that she wasn't as clever as what she herself had thought. Does that make sense? Did I say that right? I mean, clearly she had a high opinion of herself, and everything that she thought was right. I mean, I'm not well versed on the whole philosophy and the ideology of the Baader-Meinhof gang, and it will take someone like a Richard Hoffman. Now, one of the ambitions that I have is to try and get Richard Hoffman on my YouTube channel. I'd love to do that, because he is the authority on the Baader-Meinhof gang. I don't think there's anything that he doesn't know about the Baader-Meinhof gang. There is another great book by Sarah Kovlin, I think. Sarah Kovlin. I'd love to get my hands on it, because Richard Hoffman interviewed Sarah Kovlin, and he said at the end of the interview, I think she knows more about the Baader-Meinhof gang than I do. So I'd be intrigued to read that book, but that book was going for 66 quid, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to spend 66 quid just to find out. But yeah, it does have that tug on me, you know, because the curiosity is just overwhelming. I have to know why he thinks that she knows more than he does on the Berlinologists gang. Anyway, the Berlinologists Complex by Stefan Aust. I got a book here by Rudi Dutschke. Now, Rudi Dutschke is part of the Berlinologists story, but he has nothing to do with the Berlinologists gang. He knew the people, but he wasn't a part of them. Tragically, he was shot by a right winger in the head, and he survived, but he was never the same again. He was one of these students, these radicals, who was very charismatic and spoke very well in front of the camera. And some people freeze up when they see a microphone in front of them, and others, it takes them up to another level because they can speak so clearly, and they have their views and their arguments very well internalized in their minds. And Rudi Dutschke was such a person. Now, sadly, there's hardly anything written of Rudi Dutschke in English. It's all in German. And this one, consequently, is also in German. But Berlin thinks highly of him. And the history of Berlin at that time and the student writings of that time, to the point where they've actually named a street after him. If you go to Berlin and you go to Checkpoint Charlie, you just go around the corner of Checkpoint Charlie, you will see his name on a street sign. That's how highly they think of him. Now, you're not going to get a name, you're not going to be named, have a street name, or have your name named after a street, because first you've got to change the name of the street in order for you to have your own name put on the sign. But Rudi Dutschke has got his name on there. So clearly, there's a lot of respect for him. Now, sadly, he's only known within, in Berlin and in Germany, and not so well known outside. Hence, most of the books are written in German. And I have to say, I don't really know that much about him. This is just the latest acquisition. I got this a couple of days ago. I got it for cheap, actually. And to have it, that is like a family member write a book on him. Could say a lot, or it could say little. By that I mean there could be a lot of information that they filtered out of the book. There's just no way of knowing, because clearly I'm no scholar on Rudi Dutschke. But if you want to know anything about the Berlinologists gang, you have to study Rudi Dutschke, because both of them go hand in hand. East Side Gallery, Two Berlins, One Wall. This is a book that Shane bought for me for Christmas, and I'm forever grateful for it. This is a book that is, it looks as though it's sort of privately published, or it's like one of those where you order the book and then they actually print you a copy. It's got that kind of vibe to it. The East Side Gallery is the Berlin Wall. When you go to Berlin and if you ever go to Berlin, you need to go and see the East Side Gallery, because that's exactly what it is. It's the Berlin Wall, where they invite artists from around the world to paint on the wall. They actually did this when the Berlin Wall was up. So when the Berlin Wall came down, they would continue to invite artists to paint on the walls. And if you ever go to Ostbaumbrücke, which is East Tree Bridge, you will then see the East Side Gallery. Now, I can't say how long it is. It's a very long wall. It's like one of the places in all of Berlin where the original Berlin Wall still stands. Now, I haven't had the chance to read this book, because this is an eye-opener in the sense that I'm always looking for things that I've never come across before, looking for angles that I've never come across before, and clearly this is one of them. To sort of know what the artists were thinking, and a lot of the artists were interviewed for this book, and for something like this, having something new to read about, where you're not always reading about the Berlin Wall itself, or you're reading about the tunnel escapes, or you're reading about the student protests and things like that, where you sort of, parts of Berlin history you already know. This is something fresh and new. So when I get to read this book, I'll be able to do a deeper review on it, because to talk about something like this, I doubt there is anything on YouTube that will actually talk about the East Side Gallery. I haven't seen anything yet. I could be proved wrong, but clearly, if you're somebody who's going to Berlin for the first time, or you've been to Berlin but you've never gone to the East Side Gallery, I recommend that you do, because you're seeing a piece of history, and it's a monument to the Cold War and what the Cold War represented, and also the artists themselves, how they express themselves, and they're expressing themselves through their work, through their art, and that art is also telling a story. So if you ever get the opportunity to go to Berlin, or if you've already been to Berlin and you're going back to Berlin, I highly recommend you go to the East Side Gallery. Okay, this is the last book. Now, this is a book that I got this really cheap, and it was a book that I got at the library, and then this is my own personal copy, and this is Bertolt Brecht by John Fuji, The Life and Lives of Bertolt Brecht. Now, he's a famous director of the theatre, and he went back to Berlin. I think he lived in the United States, and he went back to Berlin in the mid-50s. Now, anybody that's into acting, or is into the theatre, or has an appreciation of the theatre will know who this man is, because he, with Kurt Weill, wrote the Three Penny Opera. Why I bring this book up is because this author talks about Brecht in a way that I've never come across before. It literally is sort of tearing down the myth or the reputation of Bertolt Brecht, because it has a suggestion that these three women actually wrote a lot of what Bertolt Brecht was given credit for. Now, I suspect this is not something new. I know that in the 50s, for example, there were songs written by these composers, but somebody else takes the credit for it, or somebody takes the money from the royalties for it, as opposed to the real author. Now, I don't know enough about Bertolt Brecht to actually say how authentic this biography is. I haven't read enough about Bertolt Brecht to know more than what I've actually read in this book, but certainly it does sort of taint him a bit. Now, why would anybody go out of their way to ruin somebody's reputation? Although the press do that a lot. But this is clearly a book that actually does go into the story of Bertolt Brecht and those that were associated with him, these women that actually did a lot of the writing, only for him to put his signature at the end of it and take all the credit. This is something that sadly happens also in history, where history gets rewritten. And that's one of the reasons why I actually wanted to show you about this book, bring this book, and show it to all of you. It's a sad situation, a state of things where history gets rewritten from a perspective that isn't true. And I just hope that this story, as long as it's true, that I'm fine with that. As bad as it could come across, as long as the story is true, I'm always happy with that. So there's a lot of stuff that I've gone through. I've gone through quite a lot of books, and I just hope that you'll take something away from my YouTube channel. I thank you, all those that have the new subscribers, and I also would appreciate if you would give us a thumbs up and leave a comment and stick. Thank you for your comment. I really appreciate that. And this is not the easiest thing to do. To sit in front of a camera, and especially when you're not editing it. This is all live. This is straight in front of the camera, and there's no every and arm, and fluffing, and at least you're getting the truth from me. So with that, auf Wiedersehen.